everyone. I am Jessica Barnes. I am the Executive Director of Outer Banks Forever. We are the nonprofit partner supporting 3 national parks here in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, including Wright Brothers National Memorial. And really excited to have a great group of park rangers on today to talk a little bit about aviation history. So here in the Outer Banks, we celebrate being the site of the first flight that the Wright brothers took here on the sands of what was then Kitty Hawk. And what we know here about the story of the Wright brothers is that it was just the beginning of a really interesting story in aviation history. And there was a lot of innovation and really a lot of advances in technology in just a few decades after the first flight. And so we are really thrilled to have our friends from Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site here with us today to talk about one of those stories. One of those stories that I think has been incredibly influential in the history of our country. So we'll talk a little bit about sort of the connections between Tuskegee and Wright brothers, but more we just want to hear from our rangers who have joined us a little bit more about the Tuskegee history, things that they find interesting or unique about their park, and the influence that the Tuskegee Airmen had on us as a nation. So I'm going to have everyone kind of walk around and introduce themselves. So we'll start with Adair Raybon.
Hey y'all, my name is Adair Raybon. I am one of the park rangers here at Wright Brothers National Memorial. I'm from Alabama, but I have been out west for 6 years, kind of in a few different parks around Utah. So I'm really glad to be a lot closer to home here in North Carolina. And I've been here at Wright Brothers for about 8 months, and I'm really excited to learn more about the advancement, the evolution of aviation today.
Great, thanks, Adair. Frank, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Frank Tolan. I'm a park ranger here at Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. I am a native of Tuskegee. My family has connections actually with all 3 of the parks here, Tuskegee Institute, Tuskegee Airmen, as well as the Selma Montgomery site. I've only been working here at Tuskegee Airmen. It's my first park service job for about 4 years.
That's great. I'm excited to hear about those connections, Frank. We might have to ask you more questions about that specifically. But Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, you guys. I am Maria Tinker. I am the acting supervisory park ranger for Tuskegee Airmen and Tuskegee Institute National Historic Sites. I'm going to leave my video off because my connection is just a tad bit shaky today. But I actually started my career with the Park Service back in 2016 through the Greening Youth Foundation. And I've been here at the Tuskegee sites pretty much ever since. I'm also a graduate of Tuskegee University. I graduated back in 2017.
That's awesome. So Maria, we might be asking you a little more about that too. That sounds fun. So Fatima, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Fatima and I'm a park ranger at Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site. As a trained educator, I enjoyed a career as a teacher prior to beginning my role with the National Park Service in 2020. I honed my civil rights education working as a teacher intern at Tuskegee Institute and Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Sites. I also worked as a park guide on the Selma to Montgomery National Historic Trail and Brown v. Board of Education National Historical Park. And I'm excited to be here back at Tuskegee as a park ranger. And of course, I'm excited for today's program.
Well, as you can see, we have some just not only obviously experts in the field of the history of aviation and some of the key things that I know we highlight not only at Wright Brothers, but at Tuskegee, but loved hearing your connections and your history with the Park Service. So really excited to have this conversation with you guys today. So I thought we might just start off. I think that a lot of people are at least somewhat familiar with the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. But one of you like to give us just sort of a brief overview of who the Tuskegee Airmen were and what you see as the impact that they had on aviation history?
The Tuskegee Airmen were the first African Americans within the Army Air Corps, either as pilots or as support personnel. prior to the war, there had been a belief that African Americans did not have the physical or mental ability to do anything like be fighter pilots or bomber pilots or bombardiers or mechanics or any of the technical jobs like that. It was believed that African Americans were inferior and were only capable of doing menial type labor and support work. So the Tuskegee Airmen actually had to fight for the right to fight for their country. And it was through a great deal of political pressure that the openings within the Army Air Corps and other units as well opened up to African Americans. You had it starting with the civilian pilot training program in 1939. Then in 1940, they passed the Selective Service Act, which included for the first time an anti-bias clause. You were not supposed to, emphasis on supposed to, discriminate in the terms of recruitment or training. So even though there was a civilian pilot training program at both Black and white schools, if you were a white graduate of the civilian pilot training program and you applied to join the Army Air Corps, your application would have been accepted. But if you're an African American graduate of the civilian pilot training program at one of the 6 African American colleges, including Tuskegee, or one of the 2 flight schools out of Chicago, and you applied to join the Army Air Corps, your application would have been denied. But there was a young man, Yancey Williams, who had graduated from the civilian pilot training program at Howard University in Washington, D.C. When he applied to join the Army Air Corps and his application was denied, he sued with the help of the NAACP. Now, before the case went to trial, President Roosevelt, who had been receiving a great deal of political pressure from civil rights groups and the Black press, from Eleanor Roosevelt, from the group of Black advisors that he had that was unofficially known as the Black Cabinet. And plus, he was running for re-election in 1940 for a 3rd term. And he needed African American votes in the North in order to win. So when this case developed, President Roosevelt announced the start of the start of a program here at Tuskegee in the Army Air Corps, and that, of course, it was going to be a segregated program, but the pilots who came out of this would be military pilots, and that's how the Tuskegee Airmen program started. Now, they chose Tuskegee for a number of reasons. First is climate, of course. As you probably noticed, there where most military bases are in the South and Southwest, because climate pretty much year-round is conducive to things like flying. But also in the South, especially in the 1940s, you had a lot of available land. It's a rural area, so you had a lot of available land for the building of airports. But another factor, of course, is it was going to be a segregated program. And Alabama in the 1940s was most definitely a very segregated place. So those were some of the reasons why they chose Tuskegee. 2 others, of course, were Tuskegee Institute and the Veterans Hospital. The only veterans hospital in the country that was run by African Americans was located here at Tuskegee on land that had been donated by the 2nd president of Tuskegee, Robert Russell Moulton, who Moulton Field is named for. He donated about 300 acres of land to the federal government for the building of a veterans hospital for African American veterans, specifically after World War I, but of course they treated other African American veterans from early wars too. But that was specifically why it was built, World War One.
So Frank, you mentioned the Institute, and
Yes.
could you tell us a little bit about the connection between what is now Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site and the Tuskegee Institute, and sort of how those stories complement each other?
Well, for one thing, the reason why the Tuskegee Airmen is here is because of Tuskegee Institute. Tuskegee Institute had a prior relationship with the federal government and a number of programs. There was a Veterans Hospital, as I mentioned earlier. It also had all the facilities that were necessary for the teaching of ground school courses. At the stage here at Moulton Field, which was a primary stage, the airmen didn't live here at Moulton Field, they lived on campus. And that's where they went for all the ground school courses, principles of flight, physics, meteorology, physical training, all that stuff. That took place at Tuskegee Institute. And they lived on a couple of the dorm buildings on campus and got bused here for half a day for flying. Now, after this stage of training, of course, they moved on to a large airfield that had been built, which no longer exists, Tuskegee Army Airfield, for more advanced training. But the primary training was here at Tuskegee Institute and at Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site, Moulton Field.
That's really interesting to hear those connections. Sorry, go ahead, Frank.
And also the field itself, Moulton Field, was owned by Tuskegee University or Tuskegee Institute at the time. And the general manager was a Tuskegee Institute employee, the second Black graduate of MIT, G.L. Washington. I'm sorry. Yeah, G.L. Washington. And Tuskegee had also earlier hired the first African-American graduate of MIT. I'm an alumnus, so I have to get this in. The first Black graduate of MIT had also worked for Tuskegee, Robert Taylor. He's the person who had helped design most of the early buildings on campus. He was an architecture graduate from MIT. And he, along with the students who were at Tuskegee, helped to build and design the buildings that some of which still stand on campus.
Yeah, I think
Frank, may I add one, I'm sorry. I just wanted for Frank to talk about one more thing, which were the materials that were used to construct hangar number 1.
Okay. The materials also came from Brickyard Hill, which is a place here in Tuskegee where many of the bricks from the early buildings on campus came from. And the bricks were made by the students, as were the bricks from many of the early buildings on campus. The wood was Tuskegee wood. The brick was Tuskegee brick. The labor to build Moulton Field was Tuskegee students. Actually, I don't know this for absolute certain, but probably my grandfather was involved with it because he was teaching brick masonry at Tuskegee in the 1940s. He might have mentioned it, but I probably wasn't paying attention at the time because I was a little kid, But I do believe he was actually at one time the head of brick masonry department on campus. But I know he taught it back in the 40s. So no doubt he was involved in the building of Moulton Field.
That's so interesting to hear. And we talked about in your introduction, Frank, hearing the connections of your family and the story here. And Fatima, thank you for kind of prompting him to tell that story. When we talk about the Institute, one thing that came to mind while you were telling that story is we are currently working here at Wright Brothers on a potential partnership with the local high school where the students there will get to learn more about aviation in a more hands-on way, potentially even learning how to build their own functioning airplane. And so when you guys talk about the Institute, I think even just about the Tuskegee Airmen in general, we think of it as, a time in history and the influence that it had at that time. But I think it's still something that's very influential today. So I'd love to hear a little bit more, because I know all of you have connections to the Institute, about how you see the Tuskegee Institute's influence today. It's sort of, we know that there's a historical context, but that it's still something that's influencing and helping to educate people now.
I know Tuskegee University now has they no longer teach aviation, but they do have an aerospace major at this point. There is, of course, scuttlebutt that they are at some point going to pick back up the aviation program, or at least some are trying to get them to pick that back up, so to speak. Because, of course, there's a very small minority of African Americans who are involved in aviation, especially with, like the major airlines and things of that sort. It's a very small population. And certainly a school like Tuskegee, with its history, teaching those subjects would go a long way in, helping to bring the numbers up, shall we say. Also, just speaking personally, as I mentioned, my grandfather also, when my grandfather remarried, his wife's sister was married to a Tuskegee Airman. So there's that connection as well. Though he did pass long before I ever came on the scene. So I never knew him personally. But there is that family connection. Then in terms of the other sites, from my grandfather, well, my great-grandfather knew Booker T. Washington. My grandparents and my mom knew Carver. My grandfather was a student at Tuskegee. My grandmother went to high school at Tuskegee. And they met and married and had my mom. And in terms of my father, he didn't go to Tuskegee, but he did teach here for 60 years, so we forgive him. And he was involved in the civil rights movement here locally in town, and knew some of the key national figures as well. In fact, I have a picture of him somewhere with Shirley Chisholm. My dad was elected to a local office, and when Shirley Chisholm came to speak at Tuskegee, he gave her the key to the city.
That's great. Maria, did you have something you wanted to share about the Institute and sort of its influence today?
Oh, I was just going to mention that the site itself is, the university is a living history, because it is the only National Historic Site that, of course, sits on an active university campus. So all of those historical buildings that the students built themselves, beginning back, I believe the oldest one is in the 1890s. All of those buildings are still in use by the university today. Of course, we own and operate the Carver Museum and the Oaks, but Tompkins Hall, the old administration building, Carnegie, all those buildings are still used by the university today. The university is also the only historically Black college and university that actually has a veterinarian medicine program as well. So the university really is a living history site, because, of course, everyone that passes through those walls, they really kind of, let's see. in tone what Booker T. Washington was really all about. Educating the next generation, ensuring that the next generation had what they needed in order to continue the progress within the country. So those are my 2 cents.
No, that's great to hear. And like I said, I think I think sometimes when people hear these stories, particularly when they hear Tuskegee, they think of history. And so I love that idea that the Institute is living history, because it is still an active institute. It is still being influential today, and helping bring new opportunities to people today. So I think that's great. One thing I wanted to go back to, something that Frank said at the very beginning when we said, could you just sort of introduce the Tuskegee history? You mentioned that prior to the Tuskegee Airmen and the things they did during World War II, that African Americans weren't seen as capable. And so they really had to fight to become pilots. And so to me, I would love to hear your thoughts on when we think of the Tuskegee Airmen. I think people do think specifically of aviation history, but it sounds like their influence was much broader than that, sort of in the social landscape of what was happening then, because they really did have to fight to be seen as capable of doing anything that anyone else was doing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and sort of prior to what would become the civil rights movement. How do you see the Tuskegee Airmen's influence carrying through to that?
I think I'll speak on that. Of course, after Plessy versus Ferguson, that mandated segregation in all Southern states, including 4 other states that have permissible segregation. In my opinion, and I think everyone else will probably agree, the Tuskegee Airmen were basically the founders of the civil rights movement, because it was it was because of their accomplishments that Harry S. Truman integrated the military fully in 1948, and that led to Brown v. Board of Education, that led to the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, interracial marriages, and the list goes on and on. So from my opinion, the Tuskegee Airmen helped to spark the civil rights movement with their bravery.
Yeah, I love hearing that. I think that's a piece of the story of Tuskegee that not everyone makes the connection of. So I love hearing that. Maria or Frank, do you have anything to add to that, or anything else that you'd like to share as far as their influence beyond just aviation?
Then, of course, there was the Freeman Field Mutiny. There were a group of Tuskegee Airmen, the 477th, who were training as bombardiers, and started off in Michigan, but they moved them around a lot. They eventually wound up in Indiana, Freeman Field in Indiana. Unfortunately, their commanding officers were segregationists who didn't believe they were capable and did everything possible to destroy morale. Eventually, it came to a head when he segregated the officers' clubs and other facilities. As officers, you were supposed to be able to use any of the facilities that any other officer could use. So he couldn't do it directly black and white. So he came up with a way, Colonel Selway did, of segregating by classifying all the 400 African American officers at Freeman Field as trainees, and all the 250 or so white officers were classified as instructors. And there were separate facilities for each group. Of course, the ones for the trainees were far inferior than the ones for the instructors. The Tuskegee Airmen refused to go to the segregated facilities that had been set aside for them, and started in small groups trying to desegregate the facilities that they should have been able to use anyway. In a sense, it was a sit-down kind of, like sort of a sit-down strike that became famous during the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. But they started it way back in the 40s, where they would go in to the club, they would try to get served. There, of course, would be thrown out or arrested. At first, they arrested about 61 of them, 3 of whom they kept for having, for 3 they charged with having pushed aside or jostled the officer of the day. The others they released at that point. But the base commander came up with a base order, where if you sign this base order, you're basically giving up your rights as an officer and agreeing with segregation. Of the 400 Tuskegee Airmen on the base, other than the 3 that had been arrested earlier, 101 refused to sign this order, even after they were given a direct order to sign it. If you disobey a direct order during a time of war, that's considered mutiny. The penalty for mutiny ultimately could be death by firing squad. These 101 were arrested. They were sent to a prison camp in Godman Field in Kentucky. At the same base were German prisoners of war. The German prisoners of war had free reign of the place. They could go to all the facilities that the airmen could not go to. The airmen could only leave the prison enclosure for meals. Other than that, they were kept in this barbed wire enclosure with guard dogs, armed MPs, patrolling. And the German prisoners of war actually mocked them for the treatment that they were receiving at the hands of their own country. Eventually, this made it first into the African American press, Pittsburgh Courier, and papers of that sort, and before it went into the national news itself. And when that happened, a great deal of political pressure came down on the War Department to have these men released. Eventually, the 101 were released. Letters of reprimand were put in their files, which stayed in their files their entire Army career or Air Force career, when the Air Force split out. 3 were charged with court-martial. 2 they found not guilty, but they gave them a fine and released them. 1, Roger Terry, was court-martialed, given a dishonorable discharge, stripped of his rank. He was lieutenant, stripped of his rank, and fined $150. This young man was trained as a lawyer, but he could never practice law because a dishonorable discharge goes on your record as a felony conviction. So you're not able to be a lawyer, you're not able to vote or have your full rights as a citizen. It was not until about 50 years later, under President Clinton, that he received a pardon and had his fine and everything repaid and his rank restored. And of the 101 soldiers, they removed the reprimands from 15 immediately. The others could have them removed upon request. Some requested, some didn't. Some were proud of what they did and wanted, at that point, their military career was, of course, long over by 95. And so some wanted it to stay in their file because they're proud of what they did and they wanted to, be part of history, so to speak. But the actions there at Freeman Field were definitely, I would say, an early civil rights tactic, which became used throughout the civil rights movement of the 1960s. One of the leaders of the group actually was the first African-American mayor of Detroit, Coleman Young. He was a Tuskegee Airman, and he was a leader of the troublemakers, as the as the officers there would have termed him.
Yeah, Adair.
I just wanted to add, I mean, y'all know this because y'all know the story, but I was doing some research on the Freeman Field mutiny, and I was reading about the testimonies in the court martials. And the prosecution asked for the death penalty for Terry. In a war in World War II, the prosecution asked to have the death penalty on a soldier who was willing to fight and die for their country. And reading some of the testimonies, reading some of the things that those folks wrote was enlightening, despicable, inspiring. We got the whole gamut of emotions. But just that one fact, I think, if I could say one thing, it would be that these folks were willing to kill a soldier over this.
Yeah, I think so. I know I first got to meet several of your team from Tuskegee this December when we had our first flight celebration here in the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And I think, Adair, to your point, and a lot of what Frank has shared, and Fatima and Maria, is that there are parts of this story. I think we all at some point learned the very basics of this story, but the story was much more complicated than I think most people understand. And I think that, you know, I love that we have these opportunities for us to come together and share this, you know, these parts, these stories that we just don't get to hear. I think the public finds this really interesting, and it sheds a different light on this era of American history, which I think is especially important as we are starting to look ahead to the America 250 commemorations and things that are going to be happening over the next few years with the National Park Service. So really, it's just great to hear those different stories that, like I said, I think folks don't always get to hear when it comes to this story of Tuskegee. So going back to in December, when we all got to chat with each other and got to meet some of you in person here in the Outer Banks, what we were doing that day was celebrating specifically Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and his influence, not only with Tuskegee, but I know we talked about his influence even post World War II. So I'd love if one of you could just kind of give us, for those who are not familiar with General Davis, could give us a short overview of his life and his influence in Tuskegee.
So I guess I'll take this one.
Hey, this could be my class, Maria. Do you want me to call on someone else?
It's fine. So Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was a United States Air Force general, and he was, of course, a commander of the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. And he was also the first African-American brigadier general within the history of the United States Air Force. He also, after World War II, still stayed with the federal government. He did a lot of work in regards to the TSA, as well as the speed limit for highways as well. If you guys know, like the design on airplane doors, to where you have to kind of push up against them, like use weight in order to get them to open, that was something that Benjamin O. Davis Jr. actually helped to come up with. He helped to come up with the actually having to go through a scan before you actually make it through the airport security as well. So even after World War II, he was still greatly involved within the government, within the federal government realm. What's really neat about his story is that his father, Benjamin O. Davis Sr., was also a member of the U.S. Armed Forces as well. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. actually spent some time at Tuskegee University managing the ROTC program. And one of the things, I know we kind of talked a little bit about the Freeman Field Mutiny. One of the things that actually saved the life of the airman who was being court-martialed and they were asking the death penalty was the fact that those governing the board were African Americans, is what actually saved life. And Benjamin O. Davis Jr. actually sat on that board. So he had a lot of really great influence within the Tuskegee Airmen ranks. And he also, of course, did a lot for the country even after World War II. Did I do a good job of summing it up?
You did a great job. I know it was, like I said, in December, it was really exciting to hear from Doug Melville, who I think we will all hopefully be bringing back together in the fall because he has a new book coming out that really talks more about Benjamin O. Davis Jr.'s life and influence. But again, I think there are certainly people within the civil rights history space, the history of aviation space, who are familiar with him. But I love being able to bring his story to a broader audience who maybe is not as familiar with him, because it was just so inspiring to hear the adversities that he worked through. Again, I kind of keep going back to, Frank, what you said in the very beginning about, when Tuskegee first started, they had to fight just to be recognized as being capable. And then to hear what Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was able to do to then just, become a leader and have such an influence in things that we know today. I think, we talked about airplane safety, TSA, things like that he had direct influence on that are part of our lives today that we, I think, take for granted. So really interesting to hear that. Frank, did you have anything else to add to Maria's wonderful introduction, or anything specific that you think folks would find interesting about the Davis family or his history?
Well, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was here teaching ROTC back when the Veterans Hospital opened. That was somewhat controversial. The local white community here in Alabama weren't particularly thrilled with having the Veterans Hospital for African American veterans here in Tuskegee, or to have it run by African American administrators, doctors, and nurses. Actually, at the time, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was teaching ROTC, as Maria mentioned. The Klan actually marched right by the school, but Benjamin O. Davis Sr. had his ROTC students ready to protect the school, basically. So nothing actually occurred besides the march. I guess it was a show of strength, so to speak, that made them decide to just, keep it low key, as it were.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, Frank. So Adair, is there anything specific that you would like to ask or to share with the group, sort of related to, like we've talked about here in the Outer Banks? We certainly talk about the Wright brothers story quite a bit, being at the side of the first flight. But there's a lot of sort of influence and legacy that happened after that, and sort of a history of innovation. So is there anything else that you'd like to share as far as the connections between Wright Brothers National Memorial and the Tuskegee Parks?
Sure. So one of the programs that we offer during the summer is called the Wright Brothers Legacy. And what I love about that program is it's the interpreter's choice. They can choose to talk about, literally what happened with the Wright brothers and, the patents and the litigation. They can talk about space. They can talk about equality in flight. And one of the connections we consistently make is that the evolution of aviation went just exponential. First you have circles, then figure eights. Every time a new innovation, it's easier and it's faster. Equality in aviation did not make that line. And one of the things that we're trying to do this year is focused on firsts. And that can be anything from a historic first, like Benjamin O. Davis's, first star that he earned. And it can also be the firsts that occur every day here. We have folks who take their first flight to our airstrip, which is incredible to kind of link that together. So we're really looking to highlight some of the stories that people might not know, and kind of make it a little bit more obvious that perhaps there's no need for there to be nearly 3 decades in between the first man in space and the first Black woman in space. So kind of highlight, that while the social evolution is happening on maybe a different scale, it's still happening. So we are really looking forward to kind of highlighting more of those firsts, because that's our underlying theme. I mean, the Wright brothers had the first flight, and then from there, what people do with that energy, that innovation, and that persistence, especially within the Tuskegee Airmen story, that perseverance, that is kind of what we want to celebrate. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, I love that. And Fatima, is there anything else that you want to share as we kind of start to wrap up? Anything that you, again, think people might be interested in, or that we didn't get to touch on, that you really love to tell when folks come and visit your park?
One thing that I'll say, and I've always said it since I've started off as a volunteer, I really enjoyed the fact that people come from all over the world to hear about the Tuskegee story, to hear about those other innovative events that happened in the US or in the United States. So I'm just very excited to work here. And again, thank you all for your time today.
Absolutely. And Maria, is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything we didn't touch on that you think folks would be interested in?
I think Fatima, for me, really summed it up nicely. One of the things I love about working here is that we do see a lot of people who come from all over the world to actually visit the site. One of the neat things about our park is that we are right next to an actual active airport, the Tuskegee Municipal Airport. So visitors, when they do come, they are always welcome to go up to our overlook area and get a pretty nice view as planes like do little touch and goes and lands and takeoffs and whatnot from the airport that's next door. So that's always cool to witness.
Yeah, I love that. I think Adair can sort of mirror that, because we do have an airstrip at Wright Brothers National Memorial as well. And as someone who lives behind the park, I hear a lot of the flybys of the monument. They buzz the monument. They're doing touch and goes around here as well. And I do think that's it's a fun, again, it just brings back the place and the history of the place, both at Tuskegee and here in the Outer Banks, to what's happening in our sort of modern day life that, again, I think we sometimes take for granted. So love that. Frank, anything else that you want to share with us? Any other stories or family connections that we didn't touch on today?
We also sometimes have visitors who fly into Tuskegee Municipal Airport and then walk over to the park. We had that happen, I think, just Saturday. We had a group of about 4 folks who came in on a private airplane and just walked over. And yeah, it's a unique experience, let's say, but definitely fun.
Yeah, I think if I ever find someone, if anyone's watching that has a private plane that would like to do a flight from Wright Brothers to Tuskegee, I think that would be a really fun way to experience those stories together. So thank you guys so much for being here. And we look forward to continuing this partnership, continuing to share these really great stories. I personally I've been over here taking notes on all things that you guys have shared that I didn't quite know about yet. And I'm really excited to be able to share this with a broader audience, some folks that maybe haven't gotten to visit either of our parks. So just really grateful for your support and for all that you shared today.